So, as you know, this is called First You Were Seasoned, Then You Were Fried. And this topic is actually very well founded. There's a long history and research in burnout. And I'm not approaching this as an academic research presentation. Rather, I'm seeing this more as an intervention. And most of what I'm sharing today is out of my own what in the social work profession we call practice wisdom and professional experience. But there is a huge literature if you're interested in pursuing that. So it's been an area of inquiry and concern, especially in the helping professions, for decades. And of course, originally it was thought of affecting those battling on the front lines of disease and social dysfunction, but now we all find ourselves in various emergent conditions. And this title came from a workshop that we had, social work had, uh, really in the last century, which focused on social work and other allied helping professionals who have long been vulnerable to burnout and also what we call compassion fatigue and vicarious secondary trauma. But in his seminal work on this, the father of burnout, as he's called, Herbert Freudenberger, he asserted something that I've highlighted here because it's one of the main points that I want to share with you today, which is that he determined that it was the dedicated and committed who were the most likely to burn out. Because, you know, if you don't give a damn, you're probably not going to have a problem. So I guess one of the messages I want to give you is it's not your fault. You are not to blame, and that there's a certain, you know, underpinning for what many of us are feeling. I also wanted to address three levels that contribute to burnout. When Freudenberger, good old Herb there, first started his work, it was very much an emphasis on organizations and not simply individuals. But as time has gone on, and we're kind of more psychologically oriented than we have been when this got underway on the individual level, it's become more focused on the individual and what are you as an individual going to do about this. But there are macro forces, large social forces, organizational forces as well. And I'm going to concentrate on the micro forces because that was really the outline of concerns that Rob Tudor generated from the faculty. But just to remind you, we are all focusing on or operating under these large social forces. And I use the raging 2020s as kind of a reference to the roaring 1920s, which had many of the same kinds of things that we're dealing with today, an anti-scientific a bias and racial upheaval, migrations of populations within the United States or across borders. And of course, now we're dealing with a global climate crisis, which is really come to us as a result of the mass production of automobiles and the widespread use of fossil fuels. But I'm just going to give those kind of a passing glance. Um, and I wanted to note Gloria Steinem's comment at the 2017 National Women's March when she said, I have been thinking about the uses of a long life. And one of them is you remember when things were worse. And I'm not sure if they are worse. I mean, certainly in terms of the wounds to the planet, I think most thinking people recognize that. But I kind of vacillate between thinking, oh, wow, we got through that, you know, this time of strife and strain and stress. Um, and so we've gotten through the worst of it. And then another part of my mind says, this may be the good old days when we look back. So it's hard to know what is before us. And in addition to the macro level and the individual level, I also want to highlight that this is an organizational problem of culture and constraints. And here at Shepherd, of course, we are painfully aware that we've lost colleagues, a prominent person, the provost, Scott Beard, to death, and there have been many other kinds of departures. We have dwindling resources in the face of dropping enrollments, demand that we do more and more with less and less, and there's really a gap between expectations and reality. So, as one wise woman said to me recently, we're in a mess. And I think many of us can agree with that. And hopefully, the boost money that was just announced yesterday will be helpful to people, will be encouraging as a sign of appreciation for their hardship tour of duty, or allow them to purchase what they need most, which is time. So I sent out the assessment. I don't know how many of you um, were able to look at that. But if you haven't, you certainly could. Um, but I've highlighted here that if you're here, you probably have a sense that you are suffering from burnout and that the online sources to avoid or recover from burnout did not seem adequate. So hopefully you'll get something, even one thing today that will be helpful to you. Okay, so I wanted to start with a little exercise here. And I'm going to stop the screen share for just one moment. And what I want you to do, and we'll see if this works. I've done this in a live audience, people gathered in the same space, but I've never done this with, the Zoom thing. So what I want you to do, maybe counterintuitively, is take out your cell phones and I want you to turn them on and I want you to turn them all the way up. Okay, so you're going to have the volume all the way up on your cell phone. And hi, Rob, welcome. So what we're doing, and next we're going to turn off our cell phones. And I don't want you to answer your messages if you get them, but I want everyone's phone to be on and up. And let's just listen for one moment as we try to breathe normally and see if we hear anything from the constant onslaught of demands on our times, all the pings and dings and reminders and calls. And yes, you need to unmute. That would be useful. Yeah, someone said, do we need to be? Yeah, so you want to unmute if you're muted. Hello, Matthew.
Hi.
We're turning on our cell phones, unmuting and turning the volume all the way up. So maybe we're not as in demand as we think.
If I'd done it 5 minutes ago, I would have.
Okay, right. So I was in a gathering of, it was hundreds of people, to be fair, and it was just a cacophony of sound. But that doesn't seem to be stalking us today. But we do know that, even my 2-year-old grandson, if the phone pings, he knows I'm supposed to answer it, and he brings it to me. Okay, so now I would like you to turn off your cell phones or silence them, turn down the volume, and we're going to do, it'll seem longer perhaps, but we're going to do just one moment of diaphragmatic breathing. And you may be familiar with this. although some people breathe the opposite of how they should. And so what I'd like you to do is get in a fairly comfortable position. Maybe have your feet on the floor so that you feel balanced. And try to roll back your shoulders and have an open body posture. Now, what diaphragmatic breathing involves, and you might want to put one hand on your tummy. I know we're not supposed to have tummies, but when you breathe diaphragmatically, your tummy should go out when you breathe in. And you could put another hand on your chest. And let's just take 3 cleansing breaths. And when you inhale, your stomach should move out. And when you exhale, it should go back towards your spine. So your stomach will open up first and then your lungs. So we're going to do this for just 1 minute. I'm going to time that for us. And if you notice tension, you might breathe into that tension, that tense spot on the out breath. All right. There's really nothing I'm going to say that is more important than just taking your breath for 1 moment. But I am going to continue and try to focus on how stress affects us in the body. One of the distinctions that I want to make is between critical and chronic stress. And I think in the first semester, the March of 2020, we were in the situation on the left-hand side of the columns. It was a critical situation. We thought at the time that it would be of relative short duration. We didn't imagine that you all would now be in your 3rd semester of dealing with that. So we have now moved into a chronic situation where, there's differences of opinion on this, but there's no clear end in sight that we will return to what we once thought of as normalcy. So we have diminishing resources in the face of increasing demands, and this leads to a spiral of depletion and stress. And it leads to reactions stored in the body, the brain, and the psyche. And so in order to address that, we have to address each of those areas. Now, Rob, I had mentioned before you came in that you had worked to develop a, um, kind of a list of things
Yeah.
with faculty who were concerned about their own state of health. So I'm going to share a little clip. It's only 4 minutes, so it won't take too much of our time.
Are you sleeping restlessly, feeling irritable or moody, forgetting little things, and feeling overwhelmed and isolated? Don't worry, we've all been there. You're probably just stressed out. Stress isn't always a bad thing. It can be handy for a burst of extra energy and focus. like when you're playing a competitive sport or have to speak in public. But when it's continuous, the kind most of us face day in and day out, it actually begins to change your brain. Chronic stress, like being overworked or having arguments at home, can affect brain size, its structure, and how it functions, right down to the level of your genes. Stress begins with something called the hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal axis, a series of interactions between endocrine glands in the brain and on the kidney, which controls your body's reaction to stress. When your brain detects a stressful situation, your HPA axis is instantly activated and releases a hormone called cortisol, which primes your body for instant action. But high levels of cortisol over long periods of time wreak havoc on your brain. For example, chronic stress increases the activity level and number of neural connections in the amygdala, your brain's fear center. And as levels of cortisol rise, electric signals in your hippocampus, the part of the brain associated with learning, memories, and stress control, deteriorate. The hippocampus also inhibits the activity of the HPA axis, so when it weakens, so does your ability to control your stress. That's not all though. Cortisol can literally cause your brain to shrink in size. Too much of it results in the loss of synaptic connections between neurons and the shrinking of your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that regulates behaviors like concentration, decision-making, judgment, and social interaction. It also leads to fewer new brain cells being made in the hippocampus. This means chronic stress might make it harder for you to learn and remember things, and also set the stage for more serious mental problems like depression and eventually Alzheimer's disease. The effects of stress may filter right down to your brain's DNA. An experiment showed that the amount of nurturing a mother rat provides its newborn baby plays a part in determining how that baby responds to stress later in life. The pups of nurturing moms turned out less sensitive to stress because their brains developed more cortisol receptors, which stick to cortisol and dampen the stress response. The pups of negligent moms had the opposite outcome, and so became more sensitive to stress throughout life. These are considered epigenetic changes, meaning that they affect which genes are expressed without directly changing the genetic code. And these changes can be reversed if the moms are swapped. But there's a surprising result. The epigenetic changes caused by one single mother rat were passed down to many generations of rats after her. In other words, the results of these actions were inheritable. It's not all bad news though. There are many ways to reverse what cortisol does to your stressed brain. The most powerful weapons are exercise and meditation, which involves breathing deeply and being aware and focused on your surroundings. Both of these activities decrease your stress and increase the size of the hippocampus, thereby improving your memory. So don't feel defeated by the pressures of daily life. Get in control of your stress before it takes control of you.
So I wanted to highlight in this that we are trying to move out from the trauma presentation that was done last month. And what this clip highlights is that our early socialization and exposure to trauma does set the stage for how vulnerable we may be to stress. So that's important to keep in mind. And regardless of our background, over a period of time, we are going to be dealing with burnout, which is defined in a number of ways, but the definition here is emotional depletion and lack of motivation. But anyway, the original researcher in this area pointed out that we have physical as well as behavioral symptoms. And on the physical level, it's exhaustion, fatigue, maybe even headaches, gastrointestinal disorders, sleeplessness, and shortness of breath. And emotionally, we can experience frustration and anger, suspicion. And I think it's interesting to note that some people present with feelings of omnipotence or overconfidence rather than vulnerability. And they are certainly in defense against their vulnerability. But there's also an excessive use on the part of some of tranquilizers and barbiturates in the original study, which was a free clinic in New York City. So you can imagine what a stressed environment that was. And also cynicism and signs of depression. Now, of course, we're going to express these differently. Some of us may notice, and I would ask you to kind of notice what you're experiencing: an inability to listen to others, defensiveness, being reactive rather than responsive, rigidity, a loss of ability to compartmentalize and prioritize, and in some people, a real limited self-awareness and being really oblivious to how we come across to others, self-absorption, and a feeling of being under-resourced. But however we express it, and it's important to recognize that we're not all going to do the same things. The formula for burnout is that pressures and demands exceed inner and outer resources over a sustained period of time. Now, the most commonly prescribed antidote to this is a sustained period of rest or a long break, like perhaps a semester break or a Thanksgiving break or planned vacation days. But this is not always possible or adequate to dispel burnout. So instead, we can strive to create some smaller sense of spaciousness for ourselves. And so I'm going to concentrate on how we might do that. And just to write down what is your greatest pressure point or your biggest gap in resources. So any ideas you have about that, just hold on to those as we go through this. And this is my other big takeaway here, is that we want to begin with self-compassion. And there's an old Celtic prayer that I really love, which is give us compassion for confusion, especially our own. And as the saying goes, if you're not confused, you don't understand what's going on here. So the first step toward recovery is really recognition and acknowledgement, just as you are doing by your presence here and taking your time to address this and to take the assessment tool. So we know that burnout affects our perception and our ability to plan and engage with others. And the reason for this is that our perceptions and abilities to plan are compromised by our sapping of psycho-emotional energy, which is not available to us. We also tend to, as just surviving human beings, exercise our negativity bias, and we're programmed to notice and pay attention to what's wrong. And our resources of time, energy, and creativity are diminished. And all of this leads to, this was mentioned before, cynicism as one of the most commonly cited components of burnout. So in grappling with this, what we need to embrace is that stress and emotions are in the body. They are not in your head. And because they are incarnated, we have to be able to discharge them physically. And a source that I've used here and referenced in the sources is that the body keeps the score. We interiorize or somatize these reactions. So I've given some suggestions here, and I am going to post this PowerPoint for various remedies. And we have a couple of unique resources in this area. The Holistic Health Associates of Boonesboro, which practices acupuncture and Chinese medicine. And then I don't know if any of you have been to the Salt Cave in Martinsburg. You wouldn't expect that there's a salt cave in Martinsburg, but indeed there is. And that's another way of nurturing the body. So, kind of in the center of our individual efforts, and I'm not going to tell you anything that you haven't heard in other sort of self-care forums, but these are a few of my favorite things. Number one is movement, getting out of your head and into your body. And this doesn't have to be mountain climbing or extreme sports. What the research shows is that even 30 minutes a day, and it can be in 10-minute increments, has a measurable effect. And that was emphasized in the film. In meditation, there's also clear documentation of the physical and psycho-emotional benefits. And this doesn't have to be sitting for 30 minutes, doing the Om thing. I've been meditating for 38 years daily. And when I started, it was for 5 minutes, the longest 5 minutes of my life. But we have supports for that also on campus. For instance, Mindful Mondays. And I'm also doing a little plug here for music, which I probably don't have to convince anyone of. But if you're a words person, there are lots of wonderful podcasts and web pages. And I've listed a few, and they're in the resources too. And then I've got Murderous Fantasies, which may be unexpected, but this is my way of saying you can feel any way you want. Now, if we have a body that needs to be buried in the basement, we've got a whole nother level of problems. But feelings are amoral, not immoral, amoral. There is no moral judgment. You can feel anything you want, and it would be helpful for you to know how you feel, emotional intelligence and all that. And in terms of pursuing these kinds of things, there are different types of guidance or assistance available. One is counseling, and Marie and I had a discussion about this. And though there is not an employee assistance program, and that's because of people's expressed preferences, we do have insurance that covers services like this. However, I do feel I need to tell you, as I'm a member of the mental health community, there are long waiting lists at current providers. So that's an exterior barrier. But nonetheless, if you feel that that's something that could benefit you, it would be good to get on the waiting list. We may also have interior barriers. That is, we're uncomfortable with the idea of counseling. And believe it or not, this is very common even among like social work students who want to be helpers. I once shared with a class that I had benefited from Jungian analysis over a number of years. And a student said, "Oh, Dr. Crawley Woods, I would never have known that you were in therapy." And I said, "Well, Mr. Anderson, you would know if I hadn't been." It would have been very obvious. Um, there are all kinds of online self-help resources, and I've listed, things like Headspace, Craving to Quit, and there's support groups of all kinds available online for burnout specifically. But I know there are also some support groups that people have joined to support them in their professional development that, isn't necessarily confined to shepherd. There's also the ombuds consultation option. And as I've had an opportunity to tell some of our colleagues, this is confidential, informal, neutral, and independent. So you can, I'm not sure what, all the avenues of change would be, but you can count that this would be a safe space for you. And what I'm really recommending here today is peer support, the buddy system, and asking you to commit to enlisting at least one person to be a sounding board. And giving permission to another person to give you honest feedback or alert you if you exhibit signs of being, shall we say, off balance. Okay, another issue that was brought up is how do we make important life decisions during the times of prolonged stress? And I'm referring to this as when to hold and when to fold. So if you're in doubt, I always ask the question, why not wait? But if what you have always done is no longer working, it's time for a change. And that may be a small change, like in, your workload or the kinds of tasks that you're doing, or it may be a large one. It depends on where you are in the trajectory of your life. It may be time to get out or move on. But making a planned exit is essential rather than going in um, domestic abuse circles is called going screaming into the night. You do not want to do that. You want to have a planned exit. Okay, individual restoration, which is what we're going to have time to focus on most, involves setting boundaries and perhaps fasting from various devices like your computer, the phone. And my kid sister, I don't traffic in the TikTok, but my kid sister tells me even TikTok has a screen that says, haven't you been doing this long enough? We also want to get the no knack, saying no. And this really creates boundaries and also makes our yes, what we're saying yes to, more meaningful. I'm also suggesting that you identify what energizes you and what drains your energy and doing more of the first. You may also have some benefits from this time that we've been in. We all only have to get dressed from the waist up or, wear fuzzy slippers or not go on a commute, not have to find parking. So there's a certain introversion advantage here, which is important to notice. And one of the, central restorative practices of our life is an attitude of gratitude. And I would suggest that you utilize a journal or a blog to record just a few things that you're grateful for. There are also important consolations and inspirations. If you're consoling yourself with sugar, alcohol, and other drugs, you're probably going to feel good short term, but not so well over the long term. So we have the company and care of what I call fur persons that may console us. And you can do or plan something you can control, like gardening or cooking or baking or create or anticipate. And if you plan something that you have to look forward to, it not only helps you when you do it, it helps you when you imagine doing it. Okay, I'm aware of our time and it's just a few minutes after the hour and our contract is to 1:10, but I do want to make the point, and this would need to be elaborated further, and I hope the new provost will address this with departments, that any plan for restoration has to be organizational as well as individuals, because faculty and staff live their lives in organizational units. And I have some ideas for that. But what I would like to ask you to do now is, rather than focus on that, and we're not going to do the breakout because apparently I can't do the teletransportation thing. I want you to commit to just one thing you can see yourself doing. And I'm going to ask that you keep it small, you make it specific, and you plan to report your progress to just one other person. Okay, so I think it helps to give voice to that, which is why I wanted to have breakouts, which was an apparently inflated idea of mine. And I want to end with this, that commitment to self-care for those of you who have trouble doing that. Think of it as one of the things we can do for others. It's not just for the self. I would also suggest that you mind any mistreatment and not allow people to mistreat you. Not allow, unprofessional behavior in the workplace. And this is a departmental or unit issue as well. It's important for you to go to the source and to prepare in advance for potentially conflictual conversations. And some of you attended Karen Green's presentation on this, and I've linked this in the resources. And as difficult as conflict can be, it's also true that avoiding conflict, it seems counterintuitive, but it can actually escalate. And that tendency can be reduced by early intervention. So if you have something that you want to tell someone, as Karen's presentation said, let me tell you something, I urge you to do it in a mindful, prepared, intentional way. So as we come to a close here, this is one of my favorite sayings. Let us light a candle against the darkness, especially our own. And I do this daily, and actually, not just metaphorically. I light a candle against the darkness. And again, any kind of ritual that you can make to embody your intention for self-care is useful. And I am certainly willing to help that illumination process. And I have had a number of contacts from our colleagues, and I hope to be helpful to them in developing options. I've also listed some sources or resources, and some of them are academic, but most of them are resources that you can go to